There's always been popular poetry in America, from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Arrow and the Song and The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere to Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. The American public, just like most people in most cultures, have looked to poetry to be a simple, short, culturally treasured art form. The 20th century, especially modernism and the inheritors of modernism in the mid-century, did some damage to this conception of popular poetry. Writers like T.S. Eliot, Allen Ginsberg, even Sylvia Plath in her own way, were writing a poetry that was not accessible, not inviting in the ways that Frost or Longfellow had been in the past. Sure, you could read them and resonate with their words, but there was a lot of dealing with negative emotion and those things that perhaps didn't appeal to the broad general audience. And so poetry came to be seen, and we've talked about this on the channel before several times, poetry came to be seen as something that wasn't inherently a popular art form. It wasn't like movies or even novels. It was for people who sought it out. Now, there are several poets in the late 20th century and early 21st century that kind of pushed against this desire to make poetry difficult, inaccessible, fragmented, dealing with the more inner, sometimes embarrassing, sometimes even taboo emotions and experiences of life. One of the most important popular poets of the late 20th century, who is almost forgotten now, but was very present in culture, especially in the late 60s and all through the 70s, was an American poet named Rod McKuen. Now, Rod McKuen is someone who you'll often find his books at thrift stores. They're not reprinted on the shelves of Barnes & Noble. You may be able to find used copies on Amazon. But Rod McKuen was incredibly popular, especially in the early 70s. And Rod McKuen wrote about topics that were very similar to the topics that were being sung about in rock and roll in the late 60s and early 70s, especially the more sentimental, accessible, popular rock and roll. Rod McKuen was very self-motivated to get his work out there, and even started his own publishing company and his own recording company in order to get his poetry both on the page and spoken and recorded into the eyes, hands, and ears of listeners. Probably his most famous poem is, no, don't laugh. The title of this is A Cat Named Sloopy. Now, A Cat Named Sloopy is not a title like The Wasteland or Howl. It's A Cat Named Sloopy. Let's look at a little bit of it. The only earth that Sloopy knew was in her sandbox. 2 rooms on 55th Street were her domain. Every night she'd sit in the window among the avocado plants, waiting for me to come home, my arms full of canned liver and love. We'd talk into the night, and then contented but missing something. She, the earth she never knew, me, the hills I ran while growing bent. It goes on to talk about the daily life and love and, kind of morose loneliness of both the cat and the speaker. I was a madman to have stayed away 1 minute more than the appointed hour. I'd like to think a golden cowboy snatched her from the window sill, and safely saddlebagged, she rode to Arizona. She's stalking lizards in the cactus now, perhaps bitter but free. I'm bitter too, and not a free man anymore. Once was a time in New York's jungle in a tree, before I went into the world in search of other kinds of love. Nobody owned me but a cat named Sloopy. Looking back, perhaps she's been the only human thing that ever gave love back to me. It can be tricky for a serious literary writer to write about a cat. And yet, Rod McKuen was known and really loved while he was popular, for leaning into the sentimentality. There's a strong moroseness to this poem, and we can even see, that there's indications that the speaker, is having, brief love affairs, searching for some sort of meaning and not getting it, and yet he gets his meaning from the cat named Sloopy. I think maybe this is only accessible in the cultural moment of the early 70s when it was released. And yet I think we can see that there are elements that this poem shares with lots of American poems that's trying to talk about the more negative and difficult aspects of life, and yet really looking at the one bright, shining, sentimental thing, the cat who you used to come home to. And yet, as you saw towards the end of the poem, the cat ends up disappearing, ends up leaving McKuen's life. It's not clear exactly how the cat does leave. He even, imagines that another cowboy has stolen it. But it's the kind of popular poetry that America bought, that was even big business as the century waned. I want to look at two other writers who kind of straddle the turn of the millennium and lean into very popular poetry. The first is a poet who's still alive and writing today and very popular. This poet is Billy Collins. Now, Billy Collins is... I like to think of him as somewhere in between the American poet and the American stand-up comedian. If Rod McKuen was somewhere in between the American poet and kind of the sentimental Billy Joel love ballad musician, Collins leans into the wry, into the even sarcastic, but seldom cynical. This is probably his most famous poem. It's called Litany. It begins with an epigraph from another poet. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine, Jacques Criquelian. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh bird suddenly in flight. However, you are not the wind in the orchard, the plums on the counter, or the house of cards. And you are certainly not the pine-scented air. There is just no way you are the pine-scented air. It is possible that you are the fish under the bridge, maybe even the pigeon on the general's head. But you are not even close to being the field of cornflowers at dusk. And a quick look in the mirror will show you that you are neither the boots in the corner, nor the boat asleep in its boathouse. It might interest you to know, speaking of the plentiful imagery of the world, that I am the sound of rain on the roof. I also happen to be the shooting star, the evening paper blowing down an alley, and the basket of chestnuts on the kitchen table. I am also the moon in the trees and the blind woman's teacup. But don't worry, I'm not the bread and the knife. You are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife, not to mention the crystal goblet, and somehow the wine. It's worth looking up a recording of Billy Collins reading this, because Collins has this very wry and dry delivery of the poem. And you can tell he's having fun. This is a poem that's poking fun, as many critics have said. This is a poem that's been written about a lot. Poking fun at the very heart of the English poetic tradition, especially the love poem tradition. You want to compare your beloved, whether maybe they're your lover or your spouse or even a good friend. You want to compare them to the plentiful imagery of the world, as he says. And yet it can be kind of funny to think about all the ways that you could compare someone to nature, and then even say, wait a minute, there are some comparisons that just don't work. But then, okay, sure, why not? I'll compare myself. I'm the blind woman's teacup. Some, I think, have read this as a little bit of a cynical send-up of the love poem tradition and just metaphor in general. But I don't think it's cynical. I don't think he's saying, we shouldn't do this in poetry. I think he's saying, look, maybe we shouldn't take it so seriously. Let's have some fun with these comparisons. And yeah, maybe see that we're taking ourselves and our beloveds a little too seriously. And yet at the end, I think that there is a little bit of sincerity with this, you are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet, and somehow the wine. The somehow is interesting. I think you can read it as like, wow, we really shouldn't compare you to the wine. That's too big. All of a sudden that seems, to have Eucharistic imagery and all that. But okay, we'll compare you to it. I think you can read it that way, but I think you can also read it as the somehow is the kind of in a mystery. In some sort of way, yeah, it is okay to say that the beloved is the wine, even though that almost seems like a ridiculously high comparison. I don't know. How would you like to read it? One of the things I like about Billy Collins is he gets rid of a lot of the things in poetry that would hold us back from it. We can expect humor, a funny turn of phrase, a witty little insight. But he's asking us to meditate on what poetry does. I've often thought, and I've even written about this in the past, that Billy Collins should try out writing, a comedy in verse, maybe akin to Shakespeare, and see if he can do it. I bet he can. But he's writing a poetry that is accessible to people, that people are going to have fun reading, and that maybe make them feel a little sentimental, a little bit curious. He's not trying to deeply disturb us, nor in the Cat Named Sloopy is he trying to give us a sort of sentimental, even maudlin experience. He wants us to take ourselves and the world a little less seriously. Someone who stands with Billy Collins as sort of a turn of the millennia popular poet is a poet named Mary Oliver. Now, unlike Collins, who is still alive and writing and publishing very similar verse to Litany, which was written and published over 20 years ago now, this is Mary Oliver. She passed away in 2019, and she has a poetry that's a little more straightforwardly serious and yet intentionally accessible. This is called The Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I don't know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? These last two lines, tell me what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life, are probably the two most famous lines Mary Oliver ever wrote. And they are indicative of what endeared her to the readers of the early 21st century. There's a imitation, I think, of mid-century American poetry's interest in minute description of natural phenomena. This is something that she's borrowing from people like Elizabeth Bishop and even nature writers like Rachel Carson and Annie Dillard. But she's not just describing nature and then leaving us there, which is something that Elizabeth Bishop sometimes did. She's then transitioning into explicit kind of pop spiritual meditations. Now, Mary Oliver, if you just read this poem, you might think, oh, she's a very pious person. But Mary Oliver really in a way that Billy Collins also does sometimes, kind of poking at organized religion or people who take dogma and doctrine too seriously. And yet she takes the spiritual aspects of life, prayer, kneeling, desire to live in a meaningful, thoughtful way. She takes that very seriously. This movement in the poem about halfway through it from now she snaps her wings open and floats away to I don't know exactly what a prayer is. It's a sudden volta, similar to the turn in a sonnet, though this poem is in free verse. It's not interested in regular rhyme or meter, and that's okay. I mean, she's writing in the American free verse tradition. Popular poetry can be maudlin and sentimental, which, if you like that kind of thing, you'll like someone like Rod McKuen from the late 20th century. It could be a little wry and jokey, like Billy Collins. It could be a little more interested in the lushness of nature and the sort of pop spiritual introspection of Mary Oliver. And I think this leads us up to what's going on in poetry now. I made a video a few months back called How Andrews McMeel Took Over the Poetry Industry. And Andrews McMeel, which if you want to know about them as a publishing house, go watch that video. It goes into great detail. But they're the ones who champion, Rupi Kaur, R.H. Sin, and these very popular poets right now. And I think those poets remind me less of Billy Collins, who's, I think, cleverer than all of them put together. They remind me a little bit more of Rod McKuen and slightly of Mary Oliver, though they never can seem to describe nature in the lush and complex way that a master like Oliver can. They're always defaulting to cliche descriptions of nature, or even just ignoring descriptions of nature and just giving us, what will you do with your one wild and precious life? It's like they took those last few words of a Mary Oliver poem, or the last few words of A Cat Named Sloopy. Maybe it was the only human thing that ever showed me love. And they'll make a whole poem that's just that. I think of my very favorite Rupi Kaur poem. It's 3 lines, "You are your own soulmate." You could have earned that line, maybe. It's a very difficult line to say and be taken seriously. You could have earned that line maybe with a poem that, maybe kind of Sylvia Plath-like, talked about rejection and the difficulties of love and romance and sexuality, and ended up concluding, you can only rely on yourself, you are your own soulmate. Sylvia Plath may have attempted something like that, or even Rod McKuen with a story about, nighttime rendezvous leaving you empty and your cat reminding you of love. But Rupi Kaur doesn't do that, and her popularity, I fear, will fade faster than even someone like McKuen, because McKuen could tell a story or create a resonant image in a way that Kaur hasn't been able to. If this video seems down on popular poetry, it's not meant to be. And there are poets, I would point to people like Dana Gioia, Alicia Stallings, Carl Phillips, who just won the Pulitzer Prize last year. These are poets who are writing a much more complex and, yes, less accessible and more difficult poetry, but are carrying on elements of the American poetic tradition that the popular poets, I think, have decided the reading public isn't going to want to buy. And we have this distinction between poetry as literary art and poetry as popular entertainment. And Billy Collins and Mary Oliver, I think, were able to straddle that line pretty well. Yes, it's literary enough to interest the literary reader, and maybe even to inspire them to try and be a little more accessible. But it also was accessible. Mary Oliver and Billy Collins are 2 of the best-selling poets of the recent decades, until Rupi Kaur, until R.H. Sin, until Amanda Lovelace. But they're giving us a poetry which indicates an almost total, not knowledge and rejection of the American poetic tradition, but just an ignorance of the American poetic tradition. Where will poetry go from here? What does the mid-century hold? We're in 2024. The early 20th century, or 21st century, is pretty much done. Where will we go from here? What will you buy and read and recommend to others to encourage poetry continuing in the new millennium and then in the new century? What poets of the past need to be rediscovered? What is characteristically American that will go on? I'm interested in these questions. Thanks for hanging out and asking yourself to be interested in them as well. Thanks for going on this multi-video journey with us as we've looked at American poetry from our founding mother, Anne Bradstreet, all the way to our present, which may seem uncertain, but has a lot of hope and potential in it. Thanks.